Hello, everybody. This is Ben from Skipped History with another video. I'm enjoying these, and I hope you are too. And we don't have an interview coming out this week. We should return to them next week. Incredible slate of books coming up that I'm very excited about. But today I want to talk about Gaza and Israel. There has been to me, surprising amount of news this week in places like the New York Times, which has traditionally been quite favorable in its coverage of Israel and very rarely ever includes information from Palestinian authors. So things have to be really bad for the New York Times to be putting out lots of articles about starvation in Gaza. And things have to be really bad for Trump to be commenting on it and Marjorie Taylor Greene to be commenting on it, which all of those things I'll return to. And as I look at this uptick in the news, I'm thinking of historical analogs to try to understand what's going on and to understand what will occur from here, both in the Middle East and in the US. So I want to talk about some of the history and process it with you in real time. And to sort of anchor the conversation, I want to talk about Afghanistan. That relates to some of the reporting on Netanyahu. I want to talk about Guatemala in 1954. The devastation there has been on my mind as I see the devastation in Gaza. And I also want to talk about milk, like the drink or the beverage. I wonder what the distinction between a drink and a beverage is. And maybe I'll start there because that's the weirdest claim I have. But I think you'll see that it makes some sense. And bear with me, this is not a perfect analog. And there are no perfect analogs for talking about Israel and Palestine. This is very much an exceptional situation. So I hesitate to draw direct comparisons. But I do think each of these comparisons I'll draw, you'll see why they're sort of rocking around my brain. And so the reason milk is on my mind is because in 1967, there was the Six-Day War. And the Six-Day War is, according to every historian we've spoken to about Israel and Palestine, according to many other historians, the Six-Day War is the most transformative moment in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And Six-Day War, I'm going to cite some information from interviews that I'll link to. Israel defeated armies primarily from Syria, Egypt, and Jordan in just 6 days. And overnight, according to Professor Eric Alterman, American Jews began to identify with the defense of Israel. I'm reading some quotes on a different screen. Just rolling back a second, the founding of Israel was in 1948. This is also known as the Nakba. We've talked about the history of this moment in interviews with people like Professor Rashid Khalidi, whose work I'll also link to. And that history is really significant, I should say, because it's tied up with the British Empire and with Ireland. But fast forwarding to 1948, we're fast forwarding through a lot of significant history, which again, I'd point you to. There was a real lobbying campaign by some American Jews to convince the Truman administration, President Truman, late 1940s, to support the founding of Israel. At the time, the U.S. security establishment was against the founding of Israel, who worried, among other things, that support for Israel would imperil U.S. access to Middle Eastern oil. The interests and concerns of the security establishment have always been pure. And after this diplomatic effort, Truman supported the founding of Israel. But then American Jews, as Professor Alterman said, largely went back to their own business of caring about other things: separation of church and state, civil rights, building synagogues, etc. There was no real identification up until 1967. So we're talking about 1948 to 1967, this stretch of about 20 years. And previously, too, we should say, I guess we could say for the previous forever, Jews did not identify with the defense of Israel. Israel was not a large concern among the American Jewish population. But then came 1967 and the Six-Day War. And it's really this shocking, rapid victory that transformed Americans' relationship with Israel. In part, the transformation occurred among American Jews. Professor Alterman says that after the war, American Jewish identity became enmeshed with Zionism. After 1967, if you stepped over the line in Israel, you were functionally excommunicated from the Jewish community. Obviously, some of those instincts and perceptions and behaviors remain to this day. And part of that is a more complex conversation about Jewish identity and Jewish identity in the years after the Holocaust, and how for years after the Holocaust, it was really hard for American Jews or survivors of the Holocaust to talk about what had occurred. And this war in 1967 changed things for a lot of people. So there's a lot wrapped up in this in Jewish identity and how it changed after 1967. But suffice to say, there's scholarly consensus that this was a defining moment for American Jews. It was also a defining moment for the security establishment. Unlike in the 1940s, by 1967, we were deep in the Cold War. And as Professor Rashid Khalidi says, 1967 was really the watershed, I'm quoting our interview. After the war under LBJ, the U.S. began supplying Israel with its most advanced weapons, and later, after another war in 1973, billions of dollars in military aid. So to reiterate, 1967 is really this watershed in the security establishment also. And the reason that this history and the transformation of ideas about Israel in the U.S. in 1967 is reminding me of milk is that there was also a moment in the history of milk in the 1700s from an interview we've talked about when people suddenly began marketing milk as a miracle cure to various ailments. And this idea began in the UK, then spread to British colonies. And in the late 1800s, dietary experts started advising that you couldn't drink too much milk. And then World War I broke out, and agricultural policy dictated that American farmers double or triple the production of milk. And wartime production deepened myths about milk even more. And then those myths were then solidified as big dairy entered the scene in the 1950s. You fast forward to the food pyramid and the idea that milk is this superfood that like everybody needs, when I think people are starting to realize that maybe that's not the case. Someone else can update us on the current nutritional consensus on milk. But I'm thinking about milk because there was a point in time where there were really rapid transformations of understandings of milk that then proliferated and evolved and really became firmly entrenched in ways that made it hard to say that milk might not be the superfood that so many people think it is. And I bring up the history of something like milk almost as a sort of, I don't know, as a less loaded comparison of a transformative moment in time that helps illustrate why whenever I see a really sort of transformative moment in perceptions of something, I think it raises a lot of questions. Why did the transformative moment occur? And why have so many of the perceptions since that time lingered into the present day or calcified? Pun somewhat intended. There are so many moments like this in history that we've talked about at various points. And that is on my mind as we talk about Israel and these transformations of perceptions of Israel that occurred in 1967, and why there's such a reflex instinct still today about talking about atrocities that are clearly occurring. Why talking about those atrocities and the starvation feels so loaded for so many people when it's happening. Now, I mentioned Guatemala, and Guatemala is often on my mind as a sort of stand-in for the U.S. abetment of atrocities overseas for reasons that are rather self-motivated, self-interested, and under-examined. So the U.S. supports a coup in 1954 in Guatemala because there are fears there's a communist conspiracy going on, and those fears were fanned by publications like the New York Times. And then the other side of the coin was that the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, Secretary of State and head of the CIA, respectively, they had worked in a law firm that represented United Fruit, which owned the banana plantations in Guatemala that the government at the time wanted to nationalize. John Morse Cabot, a senior member of the State Department, also owned stock in United Fruit. So there were clear business interests, and they had lots of financial interests in supporting the coup. Just like today, if the U.S. is sending billions of dollars worth of weaponry to Israelis, that means somebody else is being paid billions of dollars in government contracts to create that weaponry and is incentivized to not only support Israel, but to support whatever Israel's actions, as devastating as they might be, are in other places like Gaza, Iran, wherever. And going back to Guatemala, a dictator had thousands of people executed within months. And then the U.S. sort of stood back as a civil war occurred and hundreds of thousands of people died. And this, there's echoes here of U.S. support of regime change in places like Indonesia. We can name dozens of examples. In Indonesia, it was something like almost 1 million people died after the U.S. supported a regime change and provided weapons. I bring up this history because a frustrating element of the coverage and discussion about the U.S. support of Israel's actions in Palestine is that it goes too unmentioned that the U.S. has a long, well-documented history of supporting atrocities and violence on scales that are impossibly large to grasp. And we're seeing that in Israel. We're seeing that go on right now. The difference, of course, that's really important to highlight, which goes back to 1967, is that politicians in the U.S. and a huge amount of our population are very open about their support for Israel no matter what. We're not talking about clandestine activity in the middle of Guatemala or El Salvador or Indonesia or whatever. talking about things that are unfolding before our very eyes, even if Israelis are preventing journalists from documenting it. We're talking about actions that people are quite openly supportive of. But that dynamic also seems to be changing somewhat this week, with Trump talking about the starvation in Gaza, which is, I can't process Trump feeling sympathy of any kind or opposing any of Israel's actions. I don't even know. And also with Marjorie Taylor Greene calling what's going on a genocide, which is another stunning, hard to make sense of change. But I think it is revealing of broader changes in perceptions of what Israel is doing. I hope it endures. I hope we can, with moral clarity, call out what is going on without fearing calling a genocide a genocide. And this brings me back to Netanyahu and Afghanistan. A few weeks ago, there was this article in the New York Times called How Netanyahu Prolonged the War in Gaza to Stay in Power, the inside story of the Prime Minister's political calculations since October 7th. This is written by Patrick Kingsley, Ronan Bergman, and Natan Ottenheimer. And this piece of reporting, which is quite long, I was in the New York Times Magazine, to be clear. This piece of reporting goes through moment by moment since October 7th, how Netanyahu, when he could have lengthened ceasefires, started ceasefires, negotiated with Hamas, and it's a very nuanced piece, I should say, going through all these sides, U.S. side, of course, included, how at various moments Netanyahu kept the war going, escalated the war, pushed it into places like Iran in order to shore up political alliances, specifically with the far right in Israel, which wants to eliminate Palestinians and completely settle all of Palestine. Settle being such a euphemistic term that I can't believe I am also adopting here. It's such an amazing piece of reporting that highlights the astonishing insensitivity of people in power, in this case Netanyahu, and how he is doing whatever he can to stay in power. And it reminds me of the Afghanistan papers, a series of articles published by the Washington Post in 2019 by reporter Craig Whitlock, RIP Washington Post. I don't think they'd be publishing anything like the Afghanistan papers anymore. So the Afghanistan papers were published in 2019, 2 years before the war ended, and they just chronicle the unbelievable levels of, again, insensitivity, but also incompetence and absurdist rationale for maintaining a war that wasn't working for just about any sides involved. And I often think about the Afghanistan papers because it felt like the kind of thing that I read in a book 50 years after an event occurred. And I was reading it as the war was still going on, albeit in its later years. And when I read this article about Netanyahu, it feels like the kind of reporting that will be made into a book that documents just the levels of horror and political self-interest that lead to these prolonged conflicts that lead to so many people dying so needlessly. And I guess this is a reminder of the importance of journalism. Also just a general group processing of a lot of this history that has been on my mind. I hope you found some of this helpful, and I hope it informs some of your perspectives or triggers some questions for you in ways that I'd be interested in hearing. It's always really interesting for me to hear from you what you're thinking about these things too. So thank you for listening to this and watching this video, and I'll be back next week with more Skipped History. Check out Skipped History on social media. I'm just posting more stuff there. A lot of it is about the Power Broker. More on the project coming back soon. I guess I need a sign off. I'll use my old one. Tune in next week to learn more about some bits of Skipped History. All right. Take care, everybody.